There is a line Daniel Plainview says once quietly, to the only person he ever truly let inside. He says he has a competition in him. He says he wants no one else to succeed. He says he hates most people. Then, he spends the rest of the film proving that every single one of those things is a defense mechanism rather than a personality trait, and that the difference between those two things is the difference between a man who feels nothing and a man who feels everything and has spent decades building walls thick enough that no one will ever be able to tell. This is the psychology of Daniel Plainview. Built from the film itself, the real man behind the character, the history of the era that produced him, and the performance that made all of it visible. Welcome to Serial Soul. Let's begin. Section 1. The Man Who Spoke to No One. There is a man at the bottom of a hole. The year is 1898. The place is New Mexico. The hole is a silver mine, and the man in it has no one with him. No partner, no crew, no friend waiting at the top with a rope. Just a pickaxe. Some rope he rigged himself, a stick of dynamite, and the kind of silence that only exists when you are underground and completely alone. For the first 14 minutes of There Will Be Blood, Daniel Plainview does not say a single word. Paul Thomas Anderson, the director, made a deliberate choice to open a nearly 3-hour film about one of the most talkative and persuasive men ever put on screen with total silence. No music with melody, no dialogue, just the sound of a pickaxe hitting rock, the creak of a rope, the grunt of a man dragging himself through dirt. Most Hollywood films would have opened with a scene that explains who the main character is, what they want, and why the audience should care. Anderson did the opposite. He gave the audience 14 minutes of a man working alone in the dark, and trusted that what they were seeing was already the whole story. The ladder breaks. Plainview falls. He hits the ground of the mine shaft and breaks his leg. The bone goes. He screams, briefly, and then goes quiet. What comes next is the moment the entire film is built on, whether most people realize it or not. He spots the silver. With a broken leg, alone at the bottom of a hole in 1898, with no one coming to help him, Daniel Plainview does not call out. He does not try to signal anyone. He crawls to the silver, collects a sample, and then hauls himself up and out of that mine by himself. The camera pulls back as he makes it to the surface, and for the first time the audience can see just how far from anything he is. Rocky terrain in every direction, no town visible, no road, just open land, and a man with one working leg who has decided that he is going to drag himself across all of it until he reaches somewhere he can cash in what he found. He does. That opening scene contains everything about Daniel Plainview that the next 2.5 hours will spend its time proving. The stubbornness, the physical toughness so extreme it becomes something else entirely. The refusal to ask for help under any circumstances. The way that pain, real and serious pain, gets immediately buried under the next task. And most of all, the aloneness. Not just the fact that he is alone in that mine, but the fact that he seems to prefer it. The mine is his natural habitat. There is no evidence in those opening minutes that Daniel Plainview has anyone waiting for him anywhere. No wife, no family, no crew. He dug that mine by himself, and he was always going to climb out of it by himself. Paul Thomas Anderson later said that when he started writing the character of Daniel Plainview, the first image that came to his mind was Count Dracula. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is a strange reference for an oil tycoon. Dracula is a creature who cannot survive in daylight, a creature whose power comes entirely from being alone in a dark space, from rising out of the ground, from operating in secret. The comparison sounds dramatic, but watch those opening minutes again. Plainview rises from underground, emerging into the light covered in dirt, carrying something that everyone else will want, but only he was willing to go down and get. Anderson said he wanted to make There Will Be Blood feel like a horror film. The horror in those opening minutes is quiet. It is the specific unease of watching a man who clearly does not need anyone and has built himself that way on purpose. The broken leg heals with a limp that stays with Plainview for the rest of the film. He is never fully fixed. He carries the damage of that mine in his body for the next 40 years of screen time, and it never slows him down, and he never mentions it. That is as precise a piece of character building as any speech the film could have given him. He was injured, doing something alone that he should not have been doing alone, and he absorbed the consequence and kept going. That pattern repeats in every relationship and every choice the character makes for the rest of the story. Jump forward to 1902. Plainview is digging again, this time with a small crew. One of his workers dies in an accident, leaving behind an infant. Without discussion, without hesitation, without anyone asking him to, Plainview takes the baby. He names the boy H.W. Plainview. He raises the child as his son. The easy reading of this moment is that Plainview is not entirely without feeling, that the adoption reveals some warmth hiding under all that ambition, and the easy reading is not entirely wrong. Across the film, the moments when Plainview is most clearly a full human being, instead of a machine, are almost always the moments when he is with H.W. He teaches the boy to walk. He carries him on the oil fields. When H.W. gets hurt, later in the film, Plainview's reaction has something in it that looks, at least for a moment, like the specific pain of a parent who cannot protect their child. But the adoption is also strategic, and Plainview admits this directly in the film's final section. H.W. was useful, a man traveling alone to small towns, asking farmers to let him drill on their land, is a suspicious figure. A man with a child at his side is something else. He looks like a family man. He looks like someone with something to lose, which means he looks like someone who can be trusted. H.W. made Daniel Plainview appear human to people who were deciding whether to hand over their land. Both things are true simultaneously, and that is the exact tension that makes Plainview such a complicated character to watch. The love is real, the strategy is real, and Plainview appears to have genuinely never seen a contradiction between them. The first time the audience hears Plainview speak, he is standing in front of a small crowd of people, H.W. beside him, asking for their trust. The speech he gives, the one where he tells the townspeople about what he can bring them, what their land is worth, what kind of future he can build for them, was largely improvised by Daniel Day-Lewis on the day of filming. Paul Thomas Anderson, watching from behind the camera, described it afterward as Plainview on a platter. He meant that Day-Lewis had found the exact voice of the character, the precise blend of charm and threat that makes Plainview so effective at getting what he wants from people. The speech is warm. It is specific. It speaks directly to what the people in front of him need to hear. And every word of it is a performance calculated to extract something from the people listening. Day-Lewis prepared for the role for over a year before filming began. He read letters written by real men who had worked in the oil fields at the turn of the century. He later said those letters were full of sentimentality, love, and loss. He listened to audio recordings of the director John Huston, whose distinctive way of speaking filtered into Plainview's voice. Anderson sent him documentaries about the era. By the time they started shooting, Anderson and Day-Lewis had spent so much time inside the character together that their conversations on set had narrowed down to questions like whether Plainview would be wearing a hat or smoking his pipe in a given scene. The character was already fully formed before the cameras turned on. What Day-Lewis built is a man who occupies physical space differently from everyone around him. Plainview stands like someone who has decided in advance that no one is going to move him. He speaks slowly, from low in his chest, with the kind of deliberateness that forces whoever is listening to slow down and match his pace or be left behind. Every gesture is measured. Nothing is wasted. When he shakes hands with someone, it looks less like a greeting and more like a physical confirmation that he is stronger than the person he is shaking hands with. He was modeled, in Anderson's early notes, on a silent film character, on someone whose psychology had to be communicated through the body because words were not available. The 14 minutes of silence at the opening of the film were not just a stylistic choice. They were instructions. They were Anderson saying that what this man does with his body will tell you more about who he is than anything he will ever say out loud. Daniel Plainview tells people exactly what they want to hear. He tells farmers he will bring their land to life. He tells towns he will build schools and roads. He tells a child he is his son. He tells a congregation he is a sinner. Every one of these statements is, in its own way, true, and every one of them is deployed because it produces a result. The man in that mine at the start of the film had already made a decision about other people. They were obstacles, resources, or interference. There was no fourth category. The 14 minutes of silence before Plainview speaks a single word are not just the prologue to his story. They are the explanation for everything that follows. He built himself in isolation so completely that by the time other people entered his life, the architecture of who he was had no room for them. They could be useful, they could be an audience, but they could not get in. And yet, before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In the entire film, there is exactly one scene where Plainview says something true about himself to another person. One moment where the performance drops. One moment where he admits, without calculation, who he actually is. That scene involves a man he believes to be his brother. And what Plainview says in it will change how every scene before it and after it reads. That scene is coming, and it is the most important 40 seconds in the film. Section 2. The real man who became the myth. Every story has a source. Every character, no matter how large they grow on screen, started somewhere before the script. Daniel Plainview did not come from nothing. He came from a real man who walked real streets, drilled real oil from real ground, bribed real politicians, and died in a real mansion with real blood on the floor. His name was Edward L. Doheny. He was born in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, the son of an Irish laborer and a schoolteacher. His teachers, by most accounts, considered him the least likely student in his class to amount to anything. He worked as a mule driver. He worked as a surveyor for the government in Kansas. He tried his hand at gold mining and came up with nothing. For years, Doheny moved from one failed job to the next, carrying the particular kind of frustration that belongs to a man who knows he is capable of more than the world has so far allowed him to demonstrate. He arrived in Los Angeles at age 36. He had very little money. He had no connections. What he had was the ability to look at a piece of ground and understand what might be underneath it. In 1892, Doheny noticed a man walking down a street in Los Angeles with dark, oily mud on his wagon wheels. He followed the mud back to its source, a vacant lot near what is now a public park in the middle of the city. He partnered with a former mining associate named Charles Canfield. Together, they bought that vacant lot for $400. They did not have sophisticated equipment. They dug using picks and shovels, and eventually a makeshift drill they constructed from a eucalyptus tree. At a depth of 460 feet, they struck oil. From that single hole in that single lot, Doheny built an empire that eventually made him, by some estimates, the richest man in America by 1925, surpassing even John D. Rockefeller. He expanded through California. He expanded into Mexico. He became the kind of man whose name appeared on streets and buildings and institutions. Doheny Drive in Los Angeles still carries his name. He donated money to churches and universities. He was the sort of wealthy man who gives generously to public causes, and the giving always seemed to arrive at convenient moments when scrutiny was high and goodwill was needed. The connection between Doheny and Daniel Plainview is not accidental or vague. Paul Thomas Anderson confirmed it directly. Plainview is from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, the same town as Doheny. Plainview also worked as a geological surveyor and as a miner before moving into oil. The mansion where the final scenes of the film were shot, where Plainview lives alone in his enormous home with his bowling alley and his alcohol, was Greystone Mansion in Beverly Hills. Doheny built that house. He built it as a wedding gift for his son, Edward Doheny Jr., known as Ned. At the time of its construction, it was the most expensive building ever built in California. The milkshake speech, the moment at the end of the film that became one of the most quoted pieces of movie dialogue in the last 30 years, was drawn from real transcripts. Anderson found the milkshake analogy in the actual congressional hearing records from the 1920s, where the concept of draining oil from neighboring land through directional drilling was explained using that exact image. The speech Plainview delivers in his bowling alley to a broken and desperate Eli Sunday was not invented. It was found in the historical record and placed in the mouth of a fictional man to explain a real technique that real oil companies used to steal from people who did not understand what was being done to them. Then there is the scandal. In 1921, Doheny went to Washington. He had a friendship with Albert Fall, who was serving as the Secretary of the Interior under President Warren Harding. Doheny wanted drilling rights on federal land, specifically on large Navy oil reserves in Kern County, California, at a place called Elk Hills. He got those rights. In exchange, his son Ned delivered a suitcase to Fall's hotel room in Washington, containing $100,000 in cash. This arrangement eventually became known as the Teapot Dome scandal, one of the biggest political corruption cases in American history up to that point. The Wall Street Journal broke the story. There were Senate investigations. There were trials that stretched across nearly a decade. Albert Fall was convicted of taking the bribe and went to prison. Doheny was tried twice for giving it. Both times, somehow, he was acquitted. When his train arrived back in Los Angeles after the first acquittal, 400 supporters met him at the station. The mayor of Los Angeles publicly called him a great American patriot. That is the world Daniel Plainview comes from. A world where the man who hands over the cash walks free, while the man who receives it goes to prison. A world where enough money and enough lawyers can make guilt disappear into paperwork. A world where a crowd meets you at the train station and calls you a patriot for surviving a bribery trial. Upton Sinclair watched all of this happen in real time. Sinclair was a writer and a committed socialist, and the Teapot Dome scandal gave him what he needed, a story about what unchecked greed actually looks like when it reaches the level of government. He wrote a novel called Oil, published in 1927, and at its center was a character named J. Arnold Ross, a kindly but compromised oil tycoon modeled on Doheny. Sinclair used Ross to make a political argument. In his version, the oilman starts out decent and gets corrupted by the system. The novel is primarily about capitalism as a force that warps even good people. Paul Thomas Anderson read Oil and was drawn to its world, to the specific texture of early California oil country, to the dust and the heat and the violence of that era. But Anderson was not interested in making Sinclair's argument. He was not making a film about capitalism corrupting a decent man. He was making something stranger and more uncomfortable than that. A film about a man who was already fully formed before the story begins. A man who did not get corrupted. A man who arrived at the starting line already containing everything he would become. Anderson took the first 150 pages of Sinclair's 500-page novel, used them for texture and setting and the general shape of the world, and then built an entirely different character from the material. He later said he did not really feel like he was adapting a book. He described himself as desperate to find something to write and using the novel as a stepping stone towards something that was entirely his own. The character that emerged from that process kept Doheny's hometown, kept his origins as a miner, kept the California oil fields, kept the pipeline ambitions, kept the mansion, kept the political corruption lurking in the background. But the internal life of the character, the psychology of the man, came from somewhere else entirely. Anderson has said that he thought of Plainview early on as a silent film character, someone whose story had to be told through physicality and action rather than speech. The 14 minutes of silence at the film's opening are a direct expression of this. You understand who Daniel Plainview is before he opens his mouth, because Anderson constructed him as a man who is defined by what he does, not by what he says. What he says is almost always a performance for someone else's benefit. What he does is who he actually is. Doheny, the real man, was more complex than any simple monster. He gave money to the Catholic Church, to universities, to the city. He loved his son. He built Greystone as a gift, the most expensive gift in California at the time, for the young man who was also his legal representative and his closest companion. Whether that love was pure or complicated by the fact that the son was also deeply entangled in his father's legal problems, no one can say cleanly. Both things were present at the same time. 4 months after Ned Doheny and his family moved into Greystone, Ned was found dead in his bedroom. His secretary, Hugh Plunkett, was also dead. The official story was that Plunkett had shot Ned and then turned the gun on himself. Rumors surrounded the deaths for decades. Ned was not buried in the Catholic cemetery with the rest of the Doheny family, which in that era carried significant meaning. Whatever happened in that bedroom, the mansion that had been built as a symbol of a father's love for his son, became the site of that son's death. The film's final scenes were shot in that house. Anderson filming Daniel Plainview alone in Greystone, drunk and raging, and destroying the last human connection he had, in the house where the real oilman's son died, is either coincidence or the most precise location scouting in American cinema. The weight of what happened in those real rooms sits underneath every frame of the bowling alley sequence. Plainview is alone in a dead man's house. He has outlived everything he built. The architecture of his success is also the architecture of his ruin. What Doheny's story gives the character of Plainview is not just biographical detail. It gives him historical legitimacy. Plainview is not a fantasy villain constructed to make a point about greed. He is a recognizable product of a real time and place. The Teapot Dome era produced men like him because the era had no mechanism to stop them. The land was open, the oil was underground, the law was thin and corruptible and slow. A man with the right combination of physical toughness, social intelligence, and total willingness to do whatever was necessary could build something enormous in a very short time. Doheny did it. Others did it. The era was built for them. What made Daniel Plainview different from the historical men who inspired him is the interiority Anderson and Day-Lewis built into the character. Doheny left behind records, lawsuits, buildings, and a scandal. He did not leave behind a scene where he confessed to a stranger that he hates most people and wants no one else to succeed. The real men of that era did not, in public, say the thing. Plainview says to the man he believes is his brother, the one true moment of unguarded speech in the entire film. That confession is the part of Plainview that has no source in the historical record. It is the part that Anderson invented. It is also the part that makes him something more than a cautionary tale about oil money and political corruption. It makes him a portrait of a specific kind of interior life, the kind that builds enormous structures on the outside precisely because the inside is somewhere no one is ever allowed to go. Doheny accumulated wealth until the legal system caught up with him, and even then he mostly escaped. Plainview accumulates until there is no one left to accumulate against. The end point is different, but the engine running both men is the same. They were both men who looked at the ground and saw something no one else had bothered to look for, and who decided that finding it gave them a right that superseded whatever rights other people thought they had. The question that Doheny's story raises and the film's story answers is simple. What does a man like that look like on the inside? Not in the boardroom, not in the courtroom, not on the day 400 people meet his train and call him a patriot. What does he look like alone in a room with no one watching? That answer requires a different kind of evidence, not congressional transcripts or property records or newspaper accounts. It requires watching what Daniel Plainview does in the moments. The film is careful to show when every other character has left the scene. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The first of those moments involves a man who shows up claiming to be his brother, and what Plainview does in that scene, and what he says, and what he cannot stop himself from feeling is going to require looking very closely at the one thing he has spent his entire life refusing to admit he needed. Section 3. The brother, the confession, and the one crack in the wall. A man named Henry shows up. He arrives at Daniel Plainview's oil operation with a letter and a story. The letter contains details about Plainview's family, enough specific information to be credible. The story is that he is Daniel's half-brother, a man named Henry Plainview, someone Daniel grew up knowing about but lost contact with over the years. Henry is calm and quiet and does not ask for much. He says he heard Daniel was doing well and wanted to find him. He presents himself not as someone who wants a piece of what Daniel has built, but as someone who simply wants to be near family. Daniel Plainview, a man who has spent his entire adult life operating alone and trusting no one, lets him in. This is the most important thing that happens in the entire film. And it is not the murder that follows it, though the murder matters enormously. The important thing is the letting in, the door opening. Because in every other scene in the film, when someone approaches Daniel Plainview with a request or an offer or an appeal to his emotions, the response is always some version of the same thing. Calculation. He assesses what the person wants, determines what he can get from them, and constructs a response designed to produce the result he needs. The warmth he shows is deployed. The stories he tells are selected. The way he shakes hands, the way he looks people in the eye, the specific promises he makes, all of it runs through a filter before it gets out. Henry does not get that version of Daniel Plainview. Henry gets something the film has not shown before and will not show again. He gets Daniel talking, really talking, not performing, not negotiating, not working toward a result, sitting across from someone in the dark and saying the thing that is actually true. The scene happens at night. The two men are alone. There is no one else around to hear, no audience to perform for, no deal being constructed. And Plainview says it plainly. He has a competition inside him. He wants no one else to succeed. He hates most people. Those words, spoken to the man he believes is his brother, are the only unguarded words Daniel Plainview says in the entire film. Every other piece of dialogue he has is shaped for someone else's consumption. When he talks to farmers, he is selling them a future they want to believe in. When he talks to business competitors, he is projecting strength and calm while calculating the angle. When he talks in church, he is saying what the pipeline requires him to say. Even his kindness toward H.W., real as it is, operates in a world where the boy's presence serves a purpose. But in that nighttime conversation with Henry, there is no purpose being served. No deal on the table, no audience. Just a man telling his brother the truth about who he is. He hates most people. That is a remarkable thing to say out loud. Most people who feel that way, and history suggests that more people feel variations of it than would ever admit to. Keep it buried under layers of social behavior. They smile at neighbors and attend community events and shake the right hands. Daniel Plainview shakes all those hands and smiles at all those neighbors and attends all those community events better than almost anyone. His public persona is almost supernaturally effective. The warmth he projects when he needs to project warmth is indistinguishable from real warmth to anyone watching from the outside. But inside the warmth is this: a competition so total it has consumed everything else. A desire not just to win, but for everyone else to lose. Not ambition in the normal sense, the wanting of good things for oneself, but something colder and more complete. The success of other people is, to Daniel Plainview, a personal injury. Their failure is a comfort. Their weakness is an opportunity. He has built an entire life around this engine, and it has made him rich and powerful and completely alone. And the only person in the world he can say any of this to is the man sitting across from him who he believes shares his blood. The film cuts from this conversation to Henry's diary. H.W., Plainview's deaf adopted son, has found the diary and read it. H.W. cannot tell his father what he found in words because H.W. lost his hearing in an accident at the oil field and communicates through signs that Plainview has not learned. But H.W. tries to warn him in the way available to him, and Plainview, who does not have the patience in this period of the film to sit with his son's new way of communicating, misses it. He puts H.W. on a train and sends him away. He means this as a solution to a problem, the problem being that H.W. is distressed and disruptive, and the oil operation needs focus. What it actually is though he cannot see the heat from inside it, is the first concrete evidence that the arrival of Henry is already costing him something. The confrontation with the false Henry happens at night at a campsite away from the main operation. Plainview wakes the man with a gun already in his hand. He asks a simple question, the name of a neighboring farm from their shared hometown in Wisconsin. Henry cannot answer. The name is not in the diary he stole from the real Henry Plainview. He does not know it, and in the pause that follows, the whole structure collapses. Henry admits it. He knew the real Henry Plainview. He met him somewhere along the way, learned his story, read his letters, took his diary after the real Henry died of tuberculosis. He came to Daniel Plainview because he was desperate and adrift and needed somewhere to land. He says, and this is the line that makes the complicated in a way that a simple murder scene would not be, that the friendship during their time together was genuine. He was not pretending to like Daniel. He was not pretending to be comfortable around him. The relationship was real, even if the identity underneath it was not. Daniel Plainview shoots him. He buries the body in a ditch near the campsite. Then he sits with the diary, looking through it, and finds photographs. A woman, a child. The real Henry Plainview, the actual half-brother he never knew, existed and is now dead from an illness, and the only record Daniel has of him is secondhand, carried by a dead imposter in a stolen diary. After the burial, the film shows Plainview alone with a bottle. He is drunk and he is weeping. This is one of the very few times in the film that Plainview shows anything that reads as grief, and the question the scene plants without answering it is who exactly he is weeping for. The man he killed was a liar. He took another man's identity to get access to a wealthy relative he had no actual claim on. By any conventional measure, Daniel Plainview had every reason to feel angry and betrayed and justified. The man deceived him. The man sat across from him in the dark and listened to the most honest thing Plainview had ever said to another human being. And his entire right to be in that conversation was built on a false name. But Plainview is not weeping with anger. He is weeping the way people weep when they lose something they needed. What the false Henry gave Plainview during the weeks they spent together was something the film has shown no one else giving him. A listener who did not want anything from him. A person whose presence did not require Daniel to perform or calculate or manage. Someone who seemed, by every available piece of evidence, to simply enjoy his company. The arrival of Henry, the real false Henry, had given Plainview what he later described as a second breath of life. That phrase is worth holding, a second breath of life. This is a man who drilled his way to wealth and power and influence, and the respect of every business rival he has ever faced, describing the arrival of a companion as something that made him feel like he could breathe again. That is not the psychology of a man who is satisfied. That is the psychology of a man who has been holding his breath for years without admitting it. The murder of the false Henry is not the act of a man who is indifferent to other people. A man truly indifferent to other people would not have needed to pull a gun on someone in the middle of the night. He would have waited for morning. He would have made a business decision and handled it cleanly and moved on. The urgency of the confrontation, the nighttime timing, the gun already in his hand, when he woke the man up, all of this suggests that Plainview could not wait. The knowledge that the man was not his brother was something he could not sleep next to. He could not be in proximity to a lie that large, because the lie was about the one thing he had allowed himself to want. He wanted a brother, not a partner, not an employee. not a useful person, a brother. Someone connected to him by something that cannot be negotiated or purchased or strategically deployed. Something that simply exists because of shared origin, because of blood, because the universe put them in the same family before either of them had a choice about it. In a life built entirely on will and effort and calculation, family was the one category that required none of those things. You did not have to earn it. You did not have to perform for it. It was either there or it was not. For a brief time, Plainview thought it was there. Then it was not. What happens after the murder of the false Henry is one of the less discussed but more telling stretches of the film. Plainview goes on. He drinks more. He becomes harder to be around. The softness that had been barely visible during Henry's time. The willingness to sit and talk at night. The brief moments of something that looked like relaxation disappears. He brings H.W. back from the school he sent him to, and the reunion between father and son has warmth in it. But the warmth is thinner than before. Something got used up in that campsite. Something that does not fully replenish. The film at this point has established something about Plainview that his business dealings could never have demonstrated on their own. He is not simply a man without feelings. He is a man who has feelings and has constructed his entire existence around never being in a position where those feelings can be used against him. The competition he described to the false Henry, the hatred of other people's success, is not a primary emotion. It is a defense built on top of something more vulnerable. A man who genuinely did not care about other people would not have needed that defense. He would simply not have cared. The defense exists because the caring exists underneath, where it cannot be reached without a blood connection to justify the vulnerability of admitting it. Family was the only key. The false Henry had a copy of that key. He used it to get inside, and what he found in was a man who was, for a few weeks, genuinely less alone than he had been in decades. Then the key turned out to be a forgery, and Plainview's response to finding out the key was a forgery was not to look for a real one. It was to destroy the door. H.W. is still in the picture. H.W. is blood, or at least, that is what Plainview believes at this point in the story. The boy is the one remaining connection that carries any weight, and for a while, that is enough. The oil business grows. The pipeline gets built. The money accumulates. The empire that one man dug out of the ground with broken bones and sheer refusal expands into something almost too large to see clearly. But the baptism is coming. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and the baptism will do something to Daniel Plainview that no business setback has ever done, that no physical injury has ever done, that not even the discovery of a dead imposter in a stolen identity managed to do. It will make him say, in front of a crowd, the one true thing about himself he has never been able to outrun. Section 4. The Baptism. The day Daniel Plainview was made to kneel. There is a church in Little Boston. It belongs to Eli Sunday. He built his congregation from the ground up in the same years that Plainview was building his oil operation, in the same dust and under the same California sky. The two men arrived in the same place at roughly the same time, and from the first moment they met, something between them recognized the other for what they were. Not enemies exactly, though they became that. Something more specific. Two men running the same fundamental operation with different tools. Plainview moved oil. Eli moved souls. Both of them were in the business of getting people to hand over something valuable in exchange for a promise. Their conflict runs through the whole film like a wire with current in it. It begins before either of them has done anything openly hostile to the other. It begins in the way Plainview looks at Eli. When they first meet, the way a man looks at someone he has immediately identified as competition, without being able to say clearly what they are competing over. The specific provocation that tips the relationship into open hostility happens at the oil derrick. Eli had been promised by Plainview that he would be allowed to bless the first well. This was a concession Plainview made to smooth relations with the community, a strategic offering of respect toward the local church that cost him nothing if he actually carried through with it. The day the well is blessed, Plainview deliberately ignores Eli. He proceeds with the ceremony through someone else, cutting Eli out in front of the entire town, in front of Eli's own congregation, without explanation and without apology. It is a casual humiliation, delivered so smoothly that it almost passes before Eli can react. Eli retaliates. He confronts Plainview and demands money for his church. Money he believes he was promised as part of the arrangement that brought Plainview to the Sunday family's land. The confrontation escalates. Plainview grabs Eli, drags him across the muddy oil field, and beats him. He does this in front of his workers. He does it openly, without any concern for what it looks like. And what it looks like is a large and powerful man, demonstrating, physically and without ambiguity, exactly where Eli Sunday stands in the hierarchy of things that matter to Daniel Plainview. Eli ends up on the ground, covered in mud, in front of the people he leads spiritually. That scene is the first half of something. The second half takes years to arrive. By the time Plainview needs Eli Sunday, his empire has run into a specific problem. He has oil. He has a plan to move that oil to the California coast through a pipeline. The pipeline would make him vastly more profitable than he already is, and would cement his dominance over every competitor in the region. But one piece of land sits directly in the path the pipeline needs to travel. That land belongs to a man named Bandy, and Bandy, a deeply religious man, will not deal with Plainview unless Plainview joins the Church of the Third Revelation, which is Eli Sunday's church. This is the corner Plainview finds himself in. The pipeline, the thing he described to an associate with the words "nobody can get it there but me," requires him to walk into Eli Sunday's church and submit to a public ceremony of religious conversion. It requires him to stand in front of Eli and Eli's congregation and perform exactly the kind of vulnerability that Plainview has spent his entire life engineering situations to avoid. He goes. What happens inside that church is one of the most uncomfortable scenes in American film. Not because of any violence or any dramatic revelation, but because of what it requires from the man at the center of it. Eli Sunday, who has been waiting for this moment with a patience that mirrors Plainview's own, runs the ceremony himself. He controls every moment of it. He stands over Plainview and guides him through a public confession, and the specific things he makes Plainview say are not accidental. Eli tells him he has lusted after women. He tells him he has sinned, and then he says the thing that lands differently from everything else. He tells Plainview that he abandoned his child, that he raised a child and then abandoned that child because the child was sick and that this was a sin. Plainview begins repeating what Eli tells him to say because that is the format of the ceremony and because the pipeline requires it. He says he is a sinner. He says he is sorry, and then he gets to the part about the child. He says he has abandoned his child. He says it again, and then the performance breaks. He says he has abandoned his boy. He says it in a way that is different from everything that came before it in the ceremony, different from the mechanical repetition of the sinner and the sorry and the blood. He says it the way a person says something they actually mean, something they have been carrying and have not been able to put down. The word boy is the tell. Eli had said child. Plainview switches to boy. That is not the script. That is something else breaking through the surface of the script. In that single word, in that shift from child to boy, the entire performance collapses. The man who has controlled every room he has ever walked into, who has shaped every conversation to produce his desired outcome, who has deployed charm and warmth and threat with equal precision for decades, loses the thread for just a moment, just long enough. He's an HW away. After the accident at the oil derrick, the explosion that cost HW his hearing, Plainview put the boy on a train. He told people it was because HW needed specialized care and education, which was also true. But the timing of it, the quickness of it, the fact that a child who had just been injured and terrified and rendered permanently unable to hear was separated from the only parent he had known, tells a more complicated story. Plainview could not fix what happened to HW, and he could not be around something he could not fix. The boy's deafness was a consequence of the drilling, which was Plainview's operation, which meant the injury existed in a space too close to Plainview's own choices for him to sit comfortably in proximity to it. He sent the boy away. And in Eli Sunday's church, when the ceremony arrived at that particular sin, Daniel Plainview could not stay behind the glass. The word boy came out of him the way things come out of people when they stop trying to manage what comes out. And Eli Sunday, who understood exactly what was happening, pressed. He pushed on it. He made Plainview say it again and again. And the repetition did something to Plainview that the initial confession could not have done alone. It made him stand in the same place twice. It made him return to it instead of moving through it. By the third time, the sound of Plainview saying he had abandoned. His boy had crossed whatever lines separates performance from confession. The congregation watched this. Eli watched this. And Plainview, who had dragged Eli across an oil field years earlier and beaten him in front of witnesses, now stood in front of those same witnesses and said the truest and most painful thing he had said since the night he told the false Henry that he had a competition inside him and hated most people. He got what he came for. Bandy allowed the pipeline. The oil moved. The money followed. By any external measure, the baptism was a success. Plainview walked in needing something and walked out having gotten it, which is the outcome he always produces. But the cost of it sits in the film differently from the cost of any previous concession Plainview has made. Every other sacrifice in the story, taking on a dead man's child, pretending to be a family man, sitting through meetings with competitors he despises, has been made from a position of control. Plainview chose those concessions. He managed them. He knew what he was giving up and what he was getting in return, and he made the calculation and proceeded. The baptism was not a calculation. Or rather, it began as one, and then stopped being one at the moment the word boy came out of his mouth. Eli Sunday understood this. The film makes clear, through the way Paul Dano plays the scene, that Eli knew exactly what he was doing when he landed on the child abandonment. He knew it because he had watched Plainview operate for years by that point. He had watched him use HW as a presentation tool in business meetings. He had seen the way Plainview's manner changed when the boy was nearby. He had seen enough to know where the opening was. What makes the baptism scene remarkable from a psychological angle is what it reveals about the architecture of Plainview's defenses. He can withstand almost everything the world throws at him. Physical injury, business betrayal, the death of workers he employed, the discovery that his brother was a fraud, competitive threats from larger oil companies with more resources. All of these he absorbs and continues. None of them get through in any visible way. The one thing that gets through is guilt about HW. That guilt exists because the love for HW is real. A man without genuine feeling for the boy would have had nothing for Eli Sunday to press on. The ceremony would have been mechanical from start to finish, and Plainview would have walked out of that church exactly as he walked in, controlled and calculating and untouched. The crack that appeared, the single moment of unmanaged emotion in a man who manages everything, could only have come from something real underneath it. The baptism scene also establishes the terms of the final confrontation in the bowling alley. It establishes them because it tells the audience and tells Plainview what Eli is capable of. Eli is capable of identifying the soft place and pressing it in public. He is capable of turning the space between two men into a stage and using it to make Plainview perform his own pain for an audience. He is capable of reversing the power dynamic that was set in the oil field years earlier, where Plainview dragged him through the mud. Eli got his reversal, and Plainview, who filed that reversal in whatever part of his mind is devoted to keeping score, did not forget it. Years will pass before they are in the same room again. By the time Eli walks back into Plainview's life, everything will have changed. Eli will be desperate. Plainview will be wealthy beyond any practical need. The pipeline will be long since built and profitable. HW will be grown and gone. And Plainview, who has been alone in that mansion for long enough that the aloneness has curdled into something darker, will be waiting. The bowling alley will be ready. But before any of that, there is the question of what the years between the baptism and the finale actually did to Daniel Plainview. Because the man who sits alone in that enormous house at the end of the film is not simply the same man, with more money and more time behind him. Something happened in those years that the film does not fully show and does not need to show, because it shows the result. A man drinking alone in rooms too large for one person. A man who has no one left to call. A man who built the thing he set out to build and arrived at the far side of it and found nothing there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happens to a person when the competition finally runs out of opponents and the hatred of other people's success has nowhere left to go is a question the film answers quietly and without explanation. The answer is sitting in a bowling alley at the bottom of a bottle, and it has been sitting there for a while. Section 5. The Boy in the Basket. What H.W. Plainview reveals about his father H.W. Plainview did not come from Daniel Plainview. He came from a hole in the ground. His father, his biological father, was one of Plainview's workers, a man who died in an accident at the oil well, while the operation was still small and the crew was still thin. The explosion killed the man and left an infant behind. The baby had no one, no mother on the scene, no family waiting anywhere that Plainview knew of. Just a child in the middle of an oil field with no claim on anything, except the fact that he was alive and his father was not. Plainview took him. The decision happened quickly, without visible deliberation, without anyone asking him to do it. One moment, there was a dead worker and an infant. The next moment, Plainview was the infant's father. He named the boy H.W. Plainview, giving the child his own last name. and from that point forward treated him as his son in every practical and public sense. H.W. traveled with him. H.W. sat beside him in meetings with landowners. H.W. stood next to him during the speeches Plainview gave to small-town communities he was trying to convince to let him drill under their land. Plainview said himself, in the film's final section, that he took the child because a man traveling alone to ask for land rights is a suspicious figure, and a man with a son at his side is something warmer and more trustworthy. He said the boy was useful. He said the arrangement served his purposes. He said this directly, without apparent regret, in a conversation designed to cause maximum pain to the grown H.W., who was sitting across from him. That statement is true. The strategic value of H.W.'s presence was real, and Plainview understood it clearly from the beginning. A man who had spent years reading other people in order to get what he wanted from them would have recognized immediately how the presence of a child changed the way those people received him. It softened the edges. It made him legible as a human being in a way that a lone prospector with a hard face and a measuring look in his eyes could never quite achieve on his own. H.W. was, among other things, a business tool, and the love was real. Both of these things lived inside the same man. At the same time, without contradiction, without the one canceling out the other, Plainview used H.W. and loved H.W. and appears never to have experienced those two facts as being in conflict. This is one of the most uncomfortable things about the character. Not that he is capable of using people, which is obvious from the first scene, but that he is capable of using people he genuinely loves and experiencing no friction between the using and the loving. The moments in the film where Plainview is most clearly and most simply a good father are real. They are not performed for an audience. The camera catches them in small ways. When H.W. returns from a period away, Plainview holds him and says that does a body good quietly in the way a person says something to themselves as much as to the person they are holding. When H.W. is injured in the explosion at the derrick, the one that costs the boy his hearing permanently, Plainview cradles him. The script describes this moment specifically. He holds the hysterical, injured, terrified child and tries to soothe him. The man who beats a competitor in public and shoots a false brother in the dark at a campsite holds his hurt son and tries to make the noise stop. The explosion that deafens H.W. happens because of drilling. Plainview's drilling. The operation Plainview built and runs and is entirely responsible for is the direct cause of the injury that will change H.W.'s life permanently. The boy loses his hearing because his father put him in proximity to something dangerous, because the oil field was the world Plainview lived in, and therefore the world H.W. grew up inside of. The connection between Plainview's ambition and H.W.'s disability is not a metaphor the film invites the audience to construct. It is a literal causal chain. The drilling caused the explosion. The explosion caused the deafness. The drilling was Plainview's. After the explosion, Plainview puts H.W. on a train. He tells people it is because the boy needs specialized education and care that the oil field cannot provide, which is accurate. Schools existed for deaf children in that era, and H.W. did need what those schools could give him. The practical justification was real, but the speed of the decision, the fact that a newly deaf child who had just experienced the most traumatic event of his young life was separated from the only parent he knew within what appears to be a very short window of time, carries a weight that the practical justification does not fully account for. What the film suggests, without stating it, is that H.W.'s deafness put Plainview in a position he could not manage. He could not fix it. He could not drill his way through it, or outmaneuver it, or buy it away. The boy's hearing was gone, and there was no action available to Plainview that would bring it back. For a man whose entire psychology is built on the belief that will and effort and refusal can overcome any obstacle, the permanent and unfixable nature of HW's condition would have been more than just sad. It would have been a specific kind of unbearable, a daily reminder that there are things his power does not reach. Sending HW away resolved that, or resolved it in the limited sense that Plainview was no longer in daily proximity to the evidence of what his oil field had done to his son. HW comes back. He comes back after a period away, and Plainview's reunion with him has genuine warmth. The older HW is played by Russell Harvard, a deaf actor who signs throughout his scenes with an interpreter named George speaking his words in English. The casting of a real deaf actor for the adult HW was a significant and correct decision, and the scenes between Plainview and the adult HW carry a specific tension that the earlier scenes between Plainview and the child HW could not have had. The child HW needed his father. The adult HW does not. The adult HW has learned to build a life in a language his father never bothered to learn. Plainview does not know sign language. He never learned it. His son has spent years developing a full and fluent interior world in a communication system that his father chose not to enter. Every conversation between them in the film's later sections requires an interpreter, a third person standing between father and son, translating. The interpreter is not just a logistical solution. He is the physical embodiment of the distance that has grown between these two men, a distance that Plainview's choices created and Plainview's indifference maintained. When the adult HW comes to Plainview to end their business partnership, he comes with his interpreter, George. He wants to move to Mexico. He wants to start his own drilling company. He wants to make a change. He tells Plainview, through George, that he loves him and that he learned to love the work because of him. He is not coming to Plainview in anger. He is coming the way a grown child comes to a parent when the time has arrived to become fully separate, with respect and acknowledgement and finality. Plainview's response is to call him a competitor, not a son who is growing up, not a person who has developed his own ambitions, a competitor. The word lands in the scene like a door closing. Plainview goes further. He tells HW that he is not really his son. He uses the phrase "bastard from a basket," a phrase so specifically designed to wound that it cannot be read as anything other than intentional cruelty. He is telling the person he raised, the person he has called his son for the boy's entire life, that the relationship was a transaction and the transaction is now concluded. HW's response to this, delivered through George, with whatever the emotional equivalent of steadiness looks like when communicated through a third person, is that he is glad they are not related by blood. He says it and leaves. Plainview sits alone. What Plainview does in the final moments of the scene with HW, the deliberate cruelty of the bastard from a basket line, is the act of a man who has decided that the relationship is over and has chosen to make the ending as clean as possible by destroying it completely. Plainview does not do things halfway. When something is finished for him, it is finished down to the foundation. He does not leave threads hanging. He does not allow for the possibility of a return or a reconciliation or a continuation in a different form. HW said he was leaving. Plainview made sure there was nothing to come back to. The tragedy of it, and the film is careful to let it be a tragedy rather than a moral lesson, is that Plainview's love for HW was the one genuine and uncalculated thing in his life that lasted across decades. Every other relationship in the film was temporary, strategic, or ended in violence. Henry, the false brother, lasted a few weeks. Eli Sunday was an adversary from the first day. Business associates came and went as the operation required. H.W. stayed. H.W. was the one person Plainview kept choosing to keep across years and distance, and the enormous change that deafness brought to how they could even communicate with each other. And Plainview destroyed it himself. He destroyed it because H.W. was leaving anyway, and Plainview would rather be the one who ends something than the one who gets left. He destroyed it because H.W. starting his own company meant H.W. becoming a competitor, and the competition inside Plainview does not make exceptions for sentiment. He destroyed it because he could not stand the specific vulnerability of being a father whose child has outgrown him, and destroying the thing himself was the only way to not feel that vulnerability in its full weight. What H.W. Plainview's arc across the film ultimately reveals about his father is this: Plainview was capable of love, real love, sustained over time, expressed in small and unperformed moments. Love that existed even when it was inconvenient, and even when the object of it was damaged, and even when keeping the relationship required effort he was not comfortable making. He was capable of it. He was not capable of letting it be bigger than everything else he was. The competition, the hatred of other people's success, the architecture of isolation built over a lifetime, all of it was too load-bearing, too central to the structure of who he had made himself into. H.W. grew up and became his own person and wanted his own things. And the moment that happened, he crossed a line from son to something else, something that could not coexist with what Plainview was. H.W. walked out, and Plainview let him go, and then made sure there was no door to walk back through. What remained after that was a man in an empty house, with no one left who had any claim on him. No son, no brother, no partner, no one whose opinion of him mattered, or whose presence changed anything about how he moved through his days. He had achieved exactly what he once said he wanted: to make enough money to go away from everyone. He had gone away from everyone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The music that plays during these final stretches of Plainview's life in the film is worth understanding on its own terms. Because what Johnny Greenwood built for this story is not a score that tells the audience how to feel. It does something stranger and more honest than that. And what it does, and why it works the way it does, is the next thing that needs to be understood about this film and the man at its center. Section 6. The sound of a man coming apart. Johnny Greenwood's score. Most films tell you how to feel. The music swells when something sad happens. It lifts when something hopeful arrives. It goes dark and low when danger is near. This is such a standard practice in cinema that most people absorb it without noticing, the way you absorb the temperature of a room when you walk into it. The music is the emotional instruction manual running underneath the images, and audiences have been trained across a century of filmmaking to follow those instructions automatically. There Will Be Blood does not do this. Johnny Greenwood, the musician Paul Thomas Anderson chose to write the score for the film, is the lead guitarist of the band Radiohead. He is also a composer of orchestral music, someone who had spent years writing pieces for classical ensembles before he ever wrote a note for a film. When Anderson approached him for There Will Be Blood, Greenwood had no significant film scoring experience. Anderson hired him anyway, Because what Greenwood did with strings and orchestras was unlike what anyone in conventional film music was doing, and the film Anderson was making required something unlike what conventional film music could provide. What Greenwood built for There Will Be Blood is a score that does not tell the audience how to feel. Instead, it tells the audience what is happening inside Daniel Plainview, at the moments when Plainview himself is working hardest to show nothing. It is music as psychological interior. It is the sound of the man underneath the performance. The opening of the film establishes this immediately. Before a single image appears on screen, before the title card showing the year 1898, before the first shot of Plainview in the mine, there is sound. Strings. Not melodic strings, not strings, playing a tune that the ear can follow and find comfort in. These strings move against each other, producing a sound that sits just at the edge of what is pleasant, and then crosses over into something that makes the body slightly tense without being able to say exactly why. The technical term for what Greenwood is doing in these moments is dissonance, which simply means notes that do not resolve into each other comfortably, notes that create friction instead of harmony. But the experience of it does not require any musical knowledge. The audience simply feels it. Something is wrong, or something is about to be wrong, or something has always been wrong and is only now becoming audible. That feeling is Daniel Plainview before he has done a single thing on screen. The specific piece Greenwood used for much of the film's early sections was a work he had already composed before the film existed. A piece called Popcorn Superhet Receiver that he wrote for the BBC in 2005. Greenwood won an award from BBC Radio for that composition. When Anderson heard it, he recognized something in it that matched what he was trying to do with Plainview, and he used sections of it throughout the film. The piece was inspired by the work of a Polish composer named Krzysztof Penderecki, specifically a composition Penderecki wrote called Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima. That piece, written in 1960, was designed to produce sounds from a string orchestra that did not sound like a string orchestra at all. It was designed to produce sounds that felt like pain made audible, like something enormous and irreversible happening to a large number of people at once. Greenwood took that approach and used it to score one man's psychology. The connection between There Will Be Blood and The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's 1980 horror film, runs through this musical lineage in a specific and documented way. Kubrick used Penderecki's music in The Shining. Both films are about a man in an isolated setting who becomes increasingly disturbed over time. Both films use the same composer's approach to string writing to signal that disturbance. The jarring quality of the string arrangements in both films produces the same physical response in an audience, a low-level but persistent discomfort that accumulates across the runtime until it has shaped how everything on screen is being received, even the scenes that look calm on the surface. Plainview in his mansion in the film's final section looks on the surface calm. He is rich, he is powerful. He is in a large and beautifully appointed house. There is no visible threat. There is no emergency. He is simply a wealthy man living in a wealthy man's home. The music underneath those scenes communicates what the images cannot, which is that this calm is the specific calm of a man who has cleared everything out. Not peace, emptiness with peace's face on it. When the first oil well of real significance begins flowing in the film, the music changes completely. The dissonant strings disappear, and what arrives instead is the final movement of a violin concerto. by Johannes Brahms. Brahms was a 19th century German composer, and his violin concerto is one of the most celebrated pieces of classical music ever written. The final movement of that concerto is bright and fast and celebratory, full of forward motion and energy. It sounds like winning. It sounds like the thing you worked for, arriving exactly as you imagined it. Anderson places this music over the image of oil flowing for the first time in a meaningful quantity. And the effect is strange, because the music is genuinely beautiful and the image it accompanies is genuinely significant. And the combination should feel triumphant. And it does feel triumphant, but also slightly wrong. The Brahms is too large for the moment, too full. It announces a victory in a register that makes the victory sound almost frightening. The way very loud applause in a small room sounds less like celebration and more like pressure. The Brahms appears twice in the film. Its second appearance matters as much as its first, and the contrast between the two moments it appears tells a story about what Plainview's success has done to him over the course of the decades the film covers. Greenwood said that the string writing throughout the score was meant to function as a sonic window into Plainview's soul. The word window is precise. A window lets you see in, but you cannot reach through it. You can observe what is on the other side without being able to touch it or change it. The music in There Will Be Blood lets the audience see into Plainview in exactly this way. It shows his interior without giving the audience access to it, which is exactly how Plainview himself operates. He can be observed, he cannot be reached. One musical motif runs through the score like a thread. Greenwood described it in analysis of the score as the prospector motif. A short three-note descending figure, three notes going downward in pitch that appears repeatedly across the film. It is simple enough that once you have heard it a few times, you begin to recognize it before it resolves. It tends to appear at moments when Plainview is most consumed by his own drive, when the ambition is running at full force and everything else is being pushed aside to make room for it. The motif does not sound triumphant when it appears. It sounds obsessive. It sounds like a thought that keeps returning no matter what else is happening. The musical equivalent of a man who cannot stop thinking about one thing regardless of what room he is in or who he is talking to. The string texture that Greenwood uses throughout the score draws on a technique associated with penderecki, where the individual string instruments in an orchestra stop playing clearly defined notes and instead produce clusters of sound, multiple pitches pressed against each other, simultaneously, creating a buzzing, dense quality that sits in the listener's chest differently from normal orchestral music. One critic who reviewed the score described the smeared string sounds as suggesting liquid welling up from underground, and the dissonance accompanying it as a kind of interior, inanimate pain. That description is almost exactly right. The music sounds like something under pressure looking for a way out, which is a reasonable description of Daniel Plainview at almost any point in the film. What makes the score's relationship to the film's psychology remarkable is what it does during the scenes where Plainview is most in control and most effective. The moments when he is delivering a speech to a community, when he is closing a land deal, when he is running his operation at peak efficiency. These are the moments when the score sometimes goes quiet or nearly quiet. Greenwood pulls back. The world Plainview is performing for gets silence or near silence, while the world underneath the performance gets the strings. The music appears most aggressively in the spaces between Plainview's public moments, in the transitions, in the nighttime scenes, in the quiet stretches when there is no audience and no performance required. This is the score telling the truth that the character cannot tell about himself. The film was also notable for the use of a piece by the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt, whose music appears in the scenes involving H.W. Pärt's music is almost the direct opposite of Greenwood's dissonant strings. It is spare and clear and built on simple intervals that resolve completely, music that sounds like open space and light. Its appearance in scenes connected to H.W. creates a sonic distinction between the world of the Father and the world of the Son that works entirely independently of the dialogue or the plot. H.W.'s musical world is clean, Plainview's is fractured. The score was ineligible for an Academy Award that year because a significant portion of it consisted of music Greenwood had written before the film existed and published independently. The Academy's rules required that a nominated score be composed specifically and originally for the film. The exclusion was widely considered an injustice by critics and film musicians, and it produced a minor controversy in the period after the film's release. The score's reputation has only grown since then. It is now routinely discussed as one of the most significant and innovative film scores of the 21st century, precisely because of what it does that conventional film scoring does not attempt. It refuses to comfort. Most film scores, even the scores for dark and difficult films, offer the audience a way to feel oriented. They say this moment is sad, or this moment is tense, or this moment is the beginning of something resolving. Greenwood's score, For There Will Be Blood, does not offer orientation. It offers pressure. It puts the audience in a state of low-level unease that matches, without ever announcing it, the state of low-level unease that is Daniel Plainview's constant interior condition. The audience does not feel this consciously. They feel it the way you feel weather changing before the rain arrives. Something in the air is different. Something is building. You cannot say exactly what it is, but your body knows it before your mind catches up. That is the experience of watching Daniel Plainview from close range. There is always something building. Anderson said he wanted to make There Will Be Blood feel like a horror film. The horror he was describing was not the horror of monsters or violence or sudden shock, though the film contains violence and the final scene is genuinely shocking. The horror was the specific horror of watching a man who has removed everything from his life that could have kept him human, remove it piece by piece across decades with total clarity and total commitment, and arrive at the end of that process in a large house with a bowling alley and a bottle and one last enemy to destroy. Greenwood's score is the sound of that process in real time. Every smeared string cluster, every descending three-note motif, every moment of Brahms arriving too large and too bright for the image it accompanies, is the sound of something being lost that cannot be recovered, not lost by accident, lost by choice repeated across a lifetime until the choosing became so automatic that Plainview himself may no longer have experienced it as choosing at all, just as the way things were. Just as the way things had always been. The bowling alley at the end of the film has no score underneath it worth mentioning. What Greenwood gives the final scene is close to silence. After everything the music has communicated across nearly 3 hours, it withdraws. The sounds that remain are entirely real, entirely physical. Footsteps on wood, the impact of a bowling pin, breathing, the terrible specific sounds of the thing that happens in that room. The silence of the score in the final scene is the most frightening musical choice in the film. Everything that needed to be said has been said. The pressure that was always building has finally found its release. And there is nothing underneath it anymore. No strings, no motif, no Brahms arriving with its too large light. Just a man in a room, at the end of something, saying he is finished. The score described the journey. The silence describes the destination. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But to understand fully what that destination means, and why Eli Sunday was the one person Plainview could not leave alive once everything else was gone, requires going back to the beginning of their relationship, to the first day they met, and what each of them recognized in the other before a single hostile word had passed between them, before the oil field beating, before the baptism, before any of it. Because the reason the bowling alley scene ends the way it ends is planted in the first scene these two men share. And what each of them saw when they looked at the other is something the film never states directly but makes completely clear. Section 7. Two salesmen in the same dust, Daniel Plainview and Eli Sunday. The Sunday family farm sits on top of an ocean of oil. Paul Sunday knows this. Paul Sunday is the one who comes to Plainview first, before his twin brother Eli knows anything about it, before any deal has been discussed, before the town of Little Boston has any idea what is underneath the ground they have been farming and praying over for years. Paul comes to Plainview quietly, gives him just enough information to be useful, takes his money, and disappears from the film almost entirely. He was the informant. He was the one who opened the door. And then his brother Eli walked through it. Eli Sunday is played by Paul Dano, and the performance is built around a specific kind of dangerous softness. Eli is young. He speaks quietly. He smiles often. He runs a small church called the Church of the Third Revelation in the community of Little Boston. And his congregation believes in him with the specific intensity that belongs to people who have found something to hold on to in a hard and uncertain life. He performs healings. He lays hands on the sick. He speaks with absolute confidence about his access to God's power. And the people around him, who have very little else to be confident about, receive that confidence as a gift. The first time Plainview and Eli are in the same scene together, nothing overtly hostile happens. They exchange words. They look at each other. And in the way each of them looks at the other, the film communicates something that will take the next 2.5 hours to fully prove. They recognize each other, not as friends, not as allies, as the same species. Both of them are in the business of arriving in a room and making the people in that room feel something specific so that those people will hand something over. Plainview makes people feel that he is trustworthy, competent, and on their side so that they will sign their land over to him at prices well below what that land is worth. Eli makes people feel that they are loved by God and that Eli is the vehicle for that love, so that they will give their time and their loyalty and their money to his church. The tools are different. The product being sold is different. The mechanism is the same. Plainview sees this immediately. His dislike of Eli is not the dislike of a practical man for a superstitious one. Though Plainview has no patience for religion as a system of belief, his dislike of Eli is the dislike one skilled operator has for another skilled operator who is working the same room. It is competitive. It is personal in the way that competition between people who are genuinely alike tends to be personal. Because what you dislike in them is the thing you recognize from the inside. Eli approaches Plainview early in the film and attempts to negotiate. He has identified that Plainview's presence in Little Boston represents an opportunity, and he wants a piece of it. He wants money for his church. He wants a role in the oil operation, or at least a visible association with it, something that would increase his standing in the community. He wants Plainview to bless the well in Eli's name, to allow Eli to be publicly credited with sanctifying the operation, which would make Eli look powerful and connected to the most significant economic event the town has ever experienced. Plainview agrees to let Eli bless the first well. Then, on the day of the blessing, Plainview has someone else do it. The decision to cut Eli out of the ceremony, publicly in front of the entire community, is so deliberate and so clean that it reads less like an impulsive slight and more like a prepared move. Plainview gave Eli something to expect and then took it away at the exact moment when taking it away would cause the maximum amount of damage to Eli's standing. He did not argue with Eli about whether the blessing would happen. He did not renegotiate. He simply acted as though the agreement did not exist and watched what Eli would do about it. What Eli did about it was confront him. The confrontation ends with Plainview dragging Eli across the oil field and hitting him in front of the crew. It ends with Eli on the ground, covered in the same oil-stained mud that covers everyone who works that field, humiliated in a way that has no immediate remedy. He cannot fight back physically. He cannot appeal to any authority. Plainview is the authority in that field. All Eli can do is get up and carry what just happened back to his church and figure out what to do with it. What he does with it is wait. The patience Eli demonstrates after the oil field scene is one of the most underappreciated things about the character. He does not attempt immediate retaliation. He does not escalate in any way that Plainview can directly respond to. He continues running his church. He continues building his congregation. He continues being the spiritual center of Little Boston, while Plainview builds the economic center of the same town. And he waits for the moment when Plainview will need something that only Eli can provide. That moment arrives in the form of Bandy's land and the pipeline. When Plainview comes to Eli's church to be baptized, the surface reading of the scene is that Plainview is humbling himself for the sake of a business deal, which is accurate. The deeper reading is that Eli has spent years constructing the exact set of conditions that would make this moment possible. Bandy would not have been in Eli's congregation if Eli had not built the kind of church that someone like Bandy would join. The requirement that Plainview be baptized would not have existed if Eli had not made his church the center of the community's spiritual life. The trap Plainview walks into in the baptism scene was built brick by brick over years by a man who understood that the best revenge against Daniel Plainview was a revenge that Plainview could not see coming and could not outmaneuver. The specific things Eli says to Plainview during the baptism, the accusations about lusting after women, about abandoning the child, about being a backslider and a sinner, are delivered with a smile. Eli's voice during the baptism ceremony has a warmth to it that is entirely constructed. He is not being warm. He is performing warmth as a frame around the specific words he is choosing, so that the cruelty of those words arrives wrapped in the language of spiritual care. This is exactly what Plainview does when he delivers his community speeches. The warmth is the vehicle. The real content is underneath it. Two salesmen. The physical direction of the baptism scene reinforces this. Eli stands above Plainview. Plainview is made to kneel, to bow his head, to repeat words someone else has chosen. The positioning of the two men in that church is the exact reversal of every other scene they share. In every other context, Plainview is the one who takes up space. He is the one who enters rooms and makes other people adjust to his presence. In the church, Eli controls the space, and Plainview must fit himself into the shape Eli has designed for him. The slapping is real and worth noting. During the baptism ceremony, Eli slaps Plainview. He does this as part of the ritual, as a physical expression of casting out sin, and the congregation accepts it in that frame. But the frame is Eli's construction. He built the ceremony. He designed its components. The slap is real. The hand hitting Plainview's face is real. And Daniel Plainview, who beat Eli in front of witnesses years earlier, stands there and accepts it because the pipeline requires it. Eli Sunday knew exactly what he was doing when he put the slap in the ceremony. The relationship between these two men is so precisely balanced, in terms of their similarity, that the film can be read as a story about what happens when two versions of the same personality type are placed in direct competition. Both are self-made. Both are performing a version of themselves for public consumption that differs significantly from who they are in private. Both are driven by a need to be the most significant figure in any given room. Both use other people's vulnerabilities as leverage. Both are willing to go further than the people around them expect. The difference between them, and it is a real difference despite everything they share, is what each of them is willing to feel. Eli wants things from people. He wants their belief and their money and their devotion. But he also wants, and this is visible in the way Dano plays him, to be loved. He wants the congregation's love to be real, even as he manipulates it. There is something in Eli that needs the transaction to also be genuine, that needs the people giving him their devotion to actually mean it. This is a vulnerability Plainview does not have. Plainview does not need anyone's love. He needs their land and their signatures and their cooperation, whether they like him or mean. The cooperation is operationally irrelevant. This is why Eli breaks before Plainview does across the arc of the film. When Eli arrives at Plainview's mansion in the final section of the film, he is described as having fallen on hard times. The specifics of his decline are not fully explained by the film, but the outlines are clear. His church is struggling financially. The economic panic that hit the country in that era has not spared Little Boston. The congregation that sustained him has been reduced or dispersed. He needs money. He comes to Plainview with a land proposition, a piece of land called the Bandy Tract, which he believes has oil underneath it and which he thinks he can broker a deal around. What he does not know, because Plainview knew years before this visit that the land was relevant, is that Plainview has already drained whatever oil existed under that land. He drilled sideways from adjacent property, reaching under the Bandy Tract without ever setting foot on it. The oil Eli thought he was coming to sell access to is already gone. The milkshake is already drunk. Plainview knows this the moment Eli arrives. He knows the entire conversation is a performance for a man who has no cards left to play, and he plays it out anyway. He lets Eli go through the pitch. He listens, he asks questions, and then at the moment of maximum exposure, when Eli has committed fully to the hope that this deal is real and that this conversation is going to save him, Plainview tells him. He uses the milkshake to explain it, the explanation drawn from actual congressional hearing transcripts about directional drilling from the Teapot Dome era, is that if you have a milkshake and someone else has a milkshake, and there is only one straw, the person with the straw can drink both milkshakes. Plainview had the straw. He drank Eli's milkshake years ago without Eli knowing it was happening. The bandy tract is empty. There is nothing to sell. What follows is not just a revelation. It is a dismantling. Plainview forces Eli to say out loud in front of him that he is a false prophet, that God is a superstition. He makes Eli perform the destruction of everything Eli has spent his life building. The same way Eli made Plainview perform the destruction of his own pride in the baptism scene years earlier. Eli does it. He says he is a false prophet. He says God is a superstition. He says these things because Plainview tells him the deal requires it, and Eli is desperate enough to say anything that might produce money at the end of the conversation. Then Plainview tells him there is no deal. There never was a deal. There was a man who saw an opportunity to finish something that had been left unfinished for 16 years, and who took it. The money was never on the table. The conversation was a closing ceremony, not a negotiation. It was Plainview doing to Eli, on a personal scale, what he did to the bandy tract without ever announcing it, draining something completely while the person it belonged to had no idea what was happening. The bowling pins follow. The final scene in the bowling alley is sometimes discussed, as if it represents Plainview losing control, as if the murder of Eli Sunday is an act of madness from a man who has finally broken down. This reading is understandable, but incomplete. Plainview is drunk in those scenes, and the alcohol and the isolation and the years have clearly taken something from him that earlier versions of the character had. The psychiatric reading of where Plainview is by the film's end is grim. The deterioration is real, but the choice to kill Eli is not a loss of control in the way that phrase usually means. A man who had truly lost control would not have set the conversation up the way Plainview set it up. He would not have constructed the false hope of the deal so carefully. He would not have waited for the exact moment of Eli's maximum exposure before delivering the truth about the bandy tract. A man who has lost control does not run a trap that cleanly. What the murder of Eli Sunday represents is the completion of something Plainview decided was necessary years before that bowling alley evening. Eli was the one person in the world who had made Plainview kneel, who had put his hands on Plainview's face in public and forced words out of him that he did not choose, who had used Plainview's love for his son as a weapon in front of a congregation. That debt had been sitting in Plainview's ledger since the baptism, and Daniel Plainview does not carry debts. The bowling alley was the payment. 2 salesmen entered the story, selling different things to the same people. One of them was willing to go further than the other, and the one who was willing to go further was always going to be the one who was still standing at the end. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What makes that ending land the way it does? Why it stays with people in a way that most film endings do not, has as much to do with what Plainview becomes in those final years as with what he does in the bowling alley. Because the man in the mansion is not simply a richer version of the man in the mine. Something fundamental changed in the decades between those two images. Something was used up, and understanding what got used up and when requires going back to a question the film raises early and never fully answers about what Daniel Plainview actually wanted from any of this. Section 8. What Daniel Plainview actually wanted. There is a line in the film that most people miss because it arrives quietly, without drama, in the middle of a conversation that is already full of more theatrical moments competing for attention. Plainview says he wants to make enough money to go away from everyone. That is the goal. Not the oil, not the pipeline, not the defeat of competitors or the accumulation of land or the building of an empire that stretches across California. Those are the methods. The goal, stated plainly by the man himself in one of the rare moments when he is not performing for an audience, is to get far enough away from other people that they cannot reach him anymore. He achieves it. He achieves it completely. By the film's final section, Plainview is living alone in a mansion so large that the sound of his own footsteps echoes back to him from the walls. He has more money than he can spend. He has no business pressures remaining that could threaten what he has built. He has outlasted every competitor, outmaneuvered every rival, survived every legal and physical and personal threat that the decades threw at him. He is, by every external measure, a man who got exactly what he said he wanted. And he is drinking alone in a bowling alley in the middle of the night, and there is no one in the world who is coming to check on him. The gap between what a person says they want and what the getting of it actually produces is one of the oldest subjects in storytelling. There will be blood does not treat this gap as a moral lesson or a warning. It treats it as a fact, the way gravity is a fact, something that operates whether or not anyone acknowledges it. Plainview wanted to go away from everyone. He went away from everyone. What he found there, the film shows without commenting on, is the logical endpoint of a psychology built entirely around self-sufficiency and the rejection of need. The need did not go away. He went away from the people who could have met it, and the need remained. Understanding what Plainview actually wanted requires going back to the structure of his psychology as the film builds it across its full runtime. He tells the false Henry that he has a competition inside him and wants no one else to succeed and hates most people. These three things are presented in that conversation as a connected set, as if they belong together, naturally, as if the competition and the hatred and the desire for other people to fail are all expressions of the same underlying condition. But they are not the same thing. They are responses to the same thing. A person who truly and completely hated other people would not need to want them to fail. Wanting someone to fail requires caring about what happens to them. It requires tracking their progress, measuring their success against your own, feeling something when they advance. Indifference would be simpler. Indifference would be easier to carry. What Plainview describes is not indifference. It is an active and consuming orientation toward other people that requires enormous energy to maintain. He is not someone who has removed other people from his inner world. He is someone for whom other people are the central organizing fact of his inner world, specifically in their role as competitors and threats. He cannot stop thinking about them. He cannot stop measuring himself against them. He cannot pass through a room without assessing everyone in it for what they want from him and what they might do to get it. That is not the psychology of a man who hates people. That is the psychology of a man who is afraid of them. The fear is not physical. Plainview is not frightened of violence or confrontation or any physical threat. The fear is of something more specific and more total. The fear of being known. The fear of being in a position where another person has accurate information about who he actually is and what he actually feels. Information they could against him. Information that would make him vulnerable in a way that no business, setback, or physical injury can produce. The false Henry got inside that wall because he carried a blood connection, or what Plainview believed was a blood connection. Family was the one category. Plainview's defenses did not fully cover because family was the one category he had decided, somewhere in the long silent years before the film begins, that he still wanted. He had closed the door on friendship. He had closed the door on partnership. He had closed the door on community and belonging and all the ordinary human arrangements that most people move through without examining. But family he had left a crack in. H.W. was the proof of that crack. He did not need to raise that child. He did not need to give the boy his name. He did not need to carry him to business meetings and keep him close through years of oil field work and teach him what he knew. He chose to do all of those things, and the choosing was not purely strategic, because a purely strategic choice would have been abandoned when the strategy was complete. H.W. was not abandoned when he stopped being useful. He was kept for years past the point where his presence served any business purpose, kept out of something that operated below the level of strategy, something closer to the bone. The false Henry was the proof of the same crack from a different angle. A man who genuinely needed no one would not have experienced a stranger claiming to be his brother as a second breath of life. That phrase, second breath of life, belongs to someone who was running out of air, someone who had been managing the oxygen depletion of deep isolation for so long that they had stopped noticing it was happening until someone opened a window, briefly, and the fresh air arrived, and they realized how long they had been breathing the same stale supply. So the question becomes why? Why build the isolation so completely if what it produces is a man weeping over a dead imposter in a muddy ditch? Why make the choices over and over that result in a mansion with no one in it and a bowling alley in the middle of the night and the last enemy in the world finally destroyed and nothing left after that? The film does not answer this directly because Plainview does not answer it directly. He does not have a scene where he sits and reflects on the origin of his psychology. He has no moment of narrated self-awareness where he traces the path from who he was before the film started to who he became inside it. What the film gives instead is the opening sequence. And the opening sequence is the answer if it is read carefully enough. He was alone in that mine before anything happened to him. The condition was already present before the story begins. He did not become a solitary and self-sufficient man in response to a betrayal, or a loss, or a specific wound the film shows. He arrived at the starting line of the story already fully formed as someone who operates alone and appears to prefer it. The mine was not a temporary circumstance. It was an expression of something already built into the structure of how he moved through the world. What the film suggests across the accumulation of its evidence is that Plainview's isolation is not the result of ambition. His ambition is the result of isolation. He did not become alone because he wanted power. He wanted power because he was already alone. And power was the one thing that the alone position could reliably produce. Power does not require intimacy. It does not require trust. It does not require allowing another person to know you. It requires only will and effort, and the refusal to stop, all of which Plainview had in quantities that exceeded everyone around him. The oil was the mechanism. The pipeline was the mechanism. The land deals and the business speeches and the cultivation of a family man image were all mechanisms. Underneath all of them was a man trying to build something large enough and solid enough that his own loneliness could not reach him through the walls. He built it. The walls were solid. The loneliness reached him anyway. By the time H.W. leaves in the film's final section, Plainview has been stripped down to the essential architecture of who he is. The son is gone. The false brother is long dead. Every business competitor has been defeated or bought out. Eli Sunday is the only person left from the years when Plainview was still building, still fighting, still moving towards something. Everyone else has departed or been removed. Eli is what remains of the world Plainview came from. This is why the bowling alley scene is not simply revenge for the baptism. Though the revenge element is real, and Plainview makes no attempt to disguise it, the scene is also a kind of final conversation with the one remaining witness to everything Plainview built. Eli Sunday was there from nearly the beginning. He watched the oil come in. He watched the community form around the operation. He was in the room or the adjacent room for the years when Plainview was most fully alive, in the sense of being engaged with the world and fighting for something. Destroying Eli is also destroying the last connection to that period. After it is done, there is truly nothing left. No son, no brother, no rival, no one who knew him when the building was still happening, and the outcome was still uncertain. The "I'm finished" that Plainview says to his butler at the end of the scene carries more weight than a report on the status of a dead body. It is a statement about a life. The competition has run its full course. Everything that could be taken has been taken. Everything that could be destroyed has been destroyed. The engine that ran him for 50 years of screen time has finally consumed all available fuel and stopped. What he actually wanted, the going away from everyone, the total self-sufficiency, the removal of all vulnerability, produced a destination that could only ever have been this: a man alone, a man finished. Not finished in the sense of ruined or defeated, finished in the sense of completed. The project is done. There is nothing left to add to it, and nothing left to protect, and no one left to fight. The film does not offer this as a tragedy in the operatic sense, the sense where a great man is brought down by a fatal flaw in a way that produces catharsis and a lesson. Plainview is not brought down. He wins. He gets everything he went after. The tragedy, if it is a tragedy, is quieter than that. It is the tragedy of a man who built exactly what he set out to build and discovered at the end of the construction, that what he built was a very large and very solid and very empty container. He filled every inch of California with his ambition and his will and his refusal. And he is still alone in a room with the same question that was always there, the one the 14 minutes of silence at the start. Asked without words, what does a man need? The film answers it the way life answers it, by showing what happens when a man decides he does not need anything, and then by showing where that decision leads, over time, across decades, through every choice that compounds on every previous choice, until the man is sitting in the rubble of the last relationship he had left. And there are no more choices to make because there are no more people in the room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What remains after everything has been answered about what Plainview wanted, and what it cost him is a question about where he fits in the larger story of what America was becoming in the years the film covers. Because Plainview is not simply a damaged individual. He is the damaged individual that a specific time and place produced. And the time and place had reasons for producing him. Reasons that go beyond any single man's psychology into something larger about what the country was asking of the people willing to go down into the ground and pull up what was underneath. Section 9. The America that made him. The year is 1898 and the land is open. That is the first fact about the world Daniel Plainview inhabits, and it is a fact that shapes everything else. The American West at the turn of the 20th century was not empty. There were people living on it and farming it and building communities on it. But it operated under conditions that a man like Plainview could exploit in ways that would be impossible a generation later. The legal frameworks protecting land rights were thin and inconsistently enforced. The understanding of what oil was worth and what it would become was not yet widespread enough for most landowners to negotiate from an informed position. The federal government's oversight of resource extraction was limited to the point of being nearly non-existent in practical terms. The infrastructure of regulation that would eventually constrain what oil companies could do had not yet been built. Into this landscape walked a man who had nothing except will and the ability to read the ground. That combination, in that specific moment in American history, was sufficient to build an empire. Not because Plainview was uniquely gifted in some abstract way, but because the conditions required exactly the skills he had, and none of the skills he lacked. He did not need to be warm or trustworthy or genuinely caring about community welfare. He needed to be able to find oil, drill it out of the ground, move it to where it could be sold, and outmaneuver anyone who stood between him and that process. The social deficits that would have crippled him in a different environment were irrelevant in the one he chose. The frontier did not require him to be a fully functioning member of human society. It required him to be the hardest working, most ruthless man in any given piece of land. He was both of those things. The real man behind the character, Edward Doheny, demonstrated that this formula worked in practice. Doheny arrived in Los Angeles with almost nothing and found oil with a eucalyptus tree for a drill and $400 for a lot. Within 3 decades, he was, by some measures, the richest man in America. The system was not rigged against men like Doheny and Plainview. The system was built in that era in ways that actively rewarded what they were: the absence of regulation, the weakness of labor protections, the ease with which land could be acquired from people who did not fully understand its value. All of these conditions functioned as a kind of amplifier for the specific psychology that both men carried. The Teapot Dome scandal, which sits in the background of the film's historical context without appearing directly in its narrative, is the clearest illustration of what that amplification produced at scale. Doheny did not bribe a government official because he was uniquely corrupt. He bribed a government official because the line between aggressive business practice and outright corruption in that era was thin enough that men of his type had been crossing it for decades with minimal consequence. The entire economy of natural resource extraction in early 20th century America operated in a space where the rules were written loosely enough that a sufficiently determined man could drive a pipeline through the gaps. This is not an excuse for what Plainview does in the film. The film does not offer it as an excuse, but it is the context without which the character makes less sense. Because Plainview did not invent the conditions he operates in. He read them accurately and responded to them with everything he had. The conditions rewarded him for doing exactly what his psychology was already inclined to do. The workers who die in Plainview's operation are a part of this context. The first death in the film happens early, the man whose infant becomes HW. It happens in the course of normal operations, through accident, and Plainview's response to it is practically efficient. He adopts the child and continues drilling. There is no indication that the death produces legal consequences, inspections, or any formal requirement to change how the operation runs. A man died and the oil is still there, and the work continues. The absence of consequence shapes what the work is allowed to be. This was not a fictional exaggeration for the purposes of the film. Worker deaths in early American oil fields and mining operations were common, legally complicated for survivors to address, and frequently absorbed by operations without significant disruption. The framework for holding employers responsible for workplace deaths, in the way that a modern legal system was still developing in that era. Plainview operates in a world where his workers can die, and the moral weight of that death falls almost entirely on his own conscience, which has been structured in a way that allows him to carry it without visible difficulty. The community of Little Boston is also part of this context. The farmers and small landowners who deal with Plainview are not stupid. They are not easily fooled in a simple way. They are people who lack the specific information and legal resources that would allow them to negotiate with Plainview from an equal position. When Plainview arrives with his family man presentation and his knowledge of what their land is worth and his ability to frame an offer that sounds generous while being well below market value for what he knows is underneath their ground, the imbalance of information is total. He knows what they have. They have only the vaguest sense of it. The speech Plainview delivers to communities when he is trying to acquire their land is worth examining in this context. The speech that Daniel Day-Lewis largely improvised on the day of filming, the one Paul Thomas Anderson called Plainview on a platter, is a masterpiece of managed information. It is full of warmth and specificity. It promises schools and roads and bread and prosperity. It frames Plainview as a man who builds things for communities, rather than a man who extracts things from them and leaves. It is designed to make the people listening feel that he is on their side, that their interests and his interests are aligned, that the best thing they can do for themselves and their families and their town is to sign whatever he puts in front of them. Most of them do. They are not wrong to trust the surface of what he presents. He does build things. He does bring economic activity. The communities he operates in are materially changed by his presence in ways that include genuine benefits alongside the extraction. The roads and schools are not entirely fictional promises. Some version of them arrives. The complexity of Plainview as a figure in his historical context is that he is not simply a predator. He is a predator who also builds, and the building is real, even when it serves the predation. This is the version of American capitalism that the film is examining, not a simple story of a villain taking from innocent victims, but a more uncomfortable story about a system that produces outcomes that are genuinely mixed, where the same force that builds a community also extracts from it, where the same man who brings economic life to a piece of land also takes far more than he gives in terms of what that land was worth, where the benefits are visible and local, and the costs are structural and diffuse, and therefore harder to measure and harder to resist. Paul Thomas Anderson said he did not feel like he was adapting Upton Sinclair's novel when he was making the film. Sinclair's novel is a socialist argument. It says that capitalism corrupts even good people, that the system is the problem and the individuals inside it are its victims as much as they are its perpetrators. Anderson's film is not that argument. Anderson's Plainview was not corrupted by capitalism. He arrived already containing what he became, and capitalism in the specific form available to him in that specific place and time gave that pre-existing condition the optimal conditions to grow to its full size. The distinction matters because it changes what the film is saying about the relationship between a person and the economic system they operate inside. Sinclair's argument is primarily structural. Anderson's film is primarily psychological. The structures are present and they matter, but they are background to the foreground of one man's interior life and the specific shape that interior life takes across decades of building and fighting and accumulating. What the historical context of the film's era adds to the psychological portrait is the understanding that Plainview's psychology was not accidental. The frontier, in the broadest sense of that word, does not produce Plainview. Plainview chooses the frontier. He goes to the places where the rules are thinnest and the land is most open, and the competition has not yet fully arrived because the conditions there match what he is. A man who needs to operate without oversight seeks out environments where oversight has not yet been established. A man who cannot tolerate genuine equality with other people gravitates towards situations where his specific advantages give him a structural edge. He did not stumble into the oil fields. He found them the same way he found the silver, by going to the places that were difficult and dangerous, and far from anything comfortable. The places other people were not yet willing to go, and staying there until the work produced something. The America of 1898 to the 1920s was making other men like Plainview at the same time it was making him. The era is sometimes called the Gilded Age, a name given to it by the writer Mark Twain to suggest that it was gold on the surface and something less appealing underneath. The men who built the oil and steel and railroad empires of that era share a family resemblance with Plainview that goes beyond business strategy. They share the psychological structure, the total orientation toward accumulation, the treatment of other people as means rather than ends, the physical toughness and the willingness to go to dangerous places and do dangerous things that more comfortable men would not consider. The intelligence, and they were all intelligent, deployed entirely in the service of getting more. John D. Rockefeller, who by the time Doheny surpassed him had already built Standard Oil into the largest corporation in American history, operated with the same fundamental logic. Andrew Carnegie built steel with it. Cornelius Vanderbilt built railroads with it. These men are not Plainview. They had different personalities, different relationships with family and community and religion, different public faces, but the engine underneath the different surfaces ran on the same fuel. The belief that what you could take was yours to take. The belief that the person who works hardest and wants it most and is willing to do what others will not has a right that supersedes the rights of people who arrive at the same situation with less of those qualities. The era rewarded that belief extravagantly, and then slowly it stopped rewarding it. The regulations came, the labor protections came, the antitrust laws came and broke Rockefeller's Standard Oil into pieces. The Teapot Dome scandal came and demonstrated that even the richest and most powerful oil men could be dragged into court and made to answer for what they had done. The era that produced Daniel Plainview was also, in the years the film covers, beginning to end. The conditions that allowed him to build what he built were becoming less available. The gaps in the law were being closed. The oversight was arriving. Plainview's mansion, by the time the film reaches it in the final section, is therefore not just the home of a rich old man who has gone strange with alcohol and isolation. It is the last redoubt of a type. The place where the man who was perfectly suited to a specific and passing moment in American history has retreated as that moment closed around him. The open land is gone. The thin legal framework has thickened. The workers now have more recourse. The communities now have more information. The conditions that allowed one man with a eucalyptus tree drill and $400 to become the richest person in the country are gone. And the man who used them to their fullest possible extent is sitting alone in the result, having outlived the world that made him possible. The film's final scene is not set in 1898. It is set roughly in the late 1920s. 3 decades have passed since the opening. And in those 3 decades, America changed in ways that rendered the original Plainview model increasingly obsolete, even as the individual Plainview continued accumulating. He won the game. The game was discontinued, and there was no next game for a man whose entire identity was built around playing that specific one. He is finished, as he says at the end, in more ways than one. The full weight of what that word means, spoken by a man in that house at that moment in that history, is only available to someone who understands what he was and what made him. The psychology and the history are not separate explanations for Daniel Plainview. They are the same explanation running through 2 different lenses. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But there is one more lens, the one that is not about history or psychology or economic systems. The one that is about what Daniel Plainview actually built inside that character in the year of preparation before filming began, in the physical choices and vocal choices and moment-to-moment decisions that turned a collection of historical research and screenplay pages into one of the most fully realized human beings ever placed on film. Because the character as written and the character as performed, identical, are related but not identical. And what Day-Lewis added in the space between the page and the screen is the thing that makes Plainview feel less like a fictional creation and more like someone who actually existed and left marks on the world that are still visible if you know where to look. Section 10, The Man Who Built the Man, Daniel Day-Lewis, and the Making of Plainview. Daniel Day-Lewis spent over a year becoming Daniel Plainview before a single frame of the film was shot. That is not a figure of speech. It is the literal timeline of what happened between Paul Thomas Anderson sending Day-Lewis an unfinished script and the first day of principal photography on There Will Be Blood. Over a year of preparation, research, physical conditioning, vocal development, and the slow construction of a complete human being from historical records, letters, documentaries, and the imagination of one of the most committed actors who has ever worked in film. Day-Lewis is known for a method of preparation that goes further than almost any other actor in the modern era. He does not prepare by reading about a character and making notes, and then arriving on set ready to perform. He prepares by trying to become the character in a more total sense, by changing his body, his voice, his movement, his daily habits, until the character is not something he puts on for the camera, but something he inhabits continuously throughout the production period. For There Will Be Blood, this process was longer and more demanding than most of his previous work, and the results produced something that critics, directors, fellow actors, and film scholars have struggled to find adequate language for. Anderson wrote the script with Day-Lewis in mind from relatively early in the process. He had never formally met Day-Lewis when he began writing Plainview, but the character was taking a shape in his imagination that seemed to require a specific kind of actor, someone capable of carrying the full weight of a character who speaks infrequently but must communicate volumes in every physical moment. Anderson had seen enough of Day-Lewis's previous work to believe he was the only person for it. He sent the script when it was roughly 3/4 finished. Day-Lewis committed to the film immediately. Anderson later said that he was not sure he would have made the film at all if Day-Lewis had declined. The preparation Day-Lewis undertook began with the physical. Plainview is a man who has spent decades doing heavy manual labor. He started as a miner, working with his body in underground spaces, and the physicality of that origin never fully left him even as he became wealthy and powerful. Day-Lewis worked to build the kind of body and movement that belongs to a man who has spent years of his life doing exactly that kind of work. The specific way muscle memory from hard physical labor shapes how a person stands and walks and uses their hands, long after the labor itself has stopped. Anderson sent Day-Lewis documentaries about the historical period to establish the visual and cultural world of the film. Day-Lewis watched them with the specific attention of someone looking not for information, but for physical details. The way men of that era held themselves, the way they gestured. The economy of movement that comes from lives spent doing difficult things in difficult conditions where wasted motion costs energy you cannot afford to spend. Day-Lewis also read letters, real letters, written by real men who had worked in the oil fields of early 20th century America. He later described those letters as being full of sentimentality, love, and loss. This detail is worth pausing on. The letters that informed his preparation for playing one of cinema's most apparently cold and emotionally shut-down characters were full of sentimentality and love and loss. He was not reading letters from men who confirmed Plainview's misanthropy. He was reading letters from men who felt things deeply and whose lives in the oil fields had produced a specific relationship between hard external conditions and rich internal lives. That research is why Plainview, in Day-Lewis's hands, never reads as simply a villain or simply a monster. The sentimentality and love and loss from those letters are present in the character. They are buried, they are covered over by decades of self-protective behavior and hardened by the conditions of the life Plainview chose, but they are there, available to anyone watching closely in the small moments the film allows between the larger scenes of conflict and dominance. The voice came from John Huston. This is one of the most specific and most documented facts about how Day-Lewis built Plainview. John Huston was an American film director whose career spanned from the 1940s through the 1980s. He directed The Maltese Falcon, The African Queen, and The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, among many others. Anderson cited The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, a film about men driven to destructive ends by the pursuit of gold in the Mexican wilderness, as one of his direct inspirations for There Will Be Blood. Day-Lewis listened to audio recordings of Huston speaking and drew something from Huston's voice, its specific weight and deliberateness, and the quality of authority it carried without apparent effort, and filtered it into Plainview's way of speaking. The result is a voice that is unlike anything Day-Lewis had used in previous roles. It is deep and slow and moves from the chest rather than the throat. It does not rush. It does not rise and fall in the patterns of normal conversational speech. It sounds like a man who has decided in advance that whatever he says, will be heard, and has therefore never developed the habit of competing for attention by raising his volume or quickening his pace. The voice alone communicates something about Plainview's relationship to the people around him before the content of any given line has registered. It says that this man operates at his own tempo and the world adjusts to him. The Little Boston speech, the community introduction, where Plainview presents himself to the farmers and landowners he is trying to persuade, was largely improvised by Day-Lewis on the day of filming. The speech in the script existed in outline, but the specific words and rhythms, and the way the warmth moves through it, the way it builds trust with an audience while simultaneously extracting what it needs from them, came from Day-Lewis in the moment. Anderson's response, that it was Plainview on a platter, suggests that Day-Lewis had found something in the improvisation that the written version had not fully captured. The character was so fully built inside Day-Lewis by the time they arrived at that scene that he could speak as Plainview without the script's exact words and produce something truer than the script alone could have achieved. This is what a year of preparation produces that a shorter process cannot. A character so thoroughly inhabited that the actor no longer needs to think about what the character would say or do in a given moment, because those answers have become automatic. They live in the body and the voice and the reflexes rather than in the conscious mind. Day-Lewis and Anderson, by the time production began, had spent so long developing Plainview together that their on-set conversations had narrowed to practical questions about costume details, whether Plainview would wear a hat in this scene, whether he would have his pipe. The psychological architecture of the character was already built and shared between them before they stepped onto the location. The physical performance that Day-Lewis delivered across the film's production carries specific details that reward close attention. The limp from the mine injury in the opening sequence stays with Plainview for the rest of the film. Day-Lewis maintained it consistently across the entire shoot, across scenes filmed weeks and months apart, across the time jumps that take Plainview from a young man in 1898 to an older and deteriorating man in the late 1920s. The limp is not identical across the decades of the story. It changes slightly as the character ages, becoming more settled into the body. The way an old injury becomes part of how a person moves, rather than something they are compensating for. The aging across the film's timeline is accomplished largely without prosthetics or heavy makeup. Day-Lewis carries the passage of decades, primarily through physical and vocal adjustment, through the way Plainview holds himself differently in the mansion scenes than he did in the oil field scenes, through the specific quality of fatigue and alcohol's effect that the later scenes require. The deterioration is written in the performance rather than applied to the face, which makes it land differently than conventionally aged movie performances. It is visible in the interior as much as the exterior. The bowling alley sequence at the film's end required Day-Lewis to play Plainview at a point of psychological and physical deterioration that the rest of the film had been building toward across its full runtime. The drunkenness, the rage, the specific quality of a man who has burned through every relationship and every meaningful connection, and arrived at a place where destruction is the only remaining action available. All of this had to be played at the far end of a character arc that Day-Lewis had been inhabiting for months of production by the time those scenes were filmed. Anderson has spoken about the bowling alley scenes in interviews with a quality of awe that is unusual for a director discussing his own film. What Day-Lewis delivered in that sequence was, by Anderson's account, something that exceeded what the script had described and exceeded what they had discussed in preparation. The scene where Plainview chases Eli Sunday around the bowling alley and beats him to death with a bowling pin, followed by the delivery of the final two words of the film, produced something in performance that Anderson described as the culmination of everything both of them had been working toward. The final two words, "I'm finished," carry everything Day-Lewis had built across the entire performance in the way they are delivered. They are not screamed. They are not whispered. They are spoken at normal volume in the same deliberate chest voice that has characterized Plainview throughout, but with an exhaustion underneath them that is new. Not the physical exhaustion of a man who has just been in a violent altercation, though that is present. A deeper exhaustion. The exhaustion of a project completed. The exhaustion of a man who has run his engine at full capacity for decades and is reporting, to himself as much as to the butler who arrives at the top of the stairs, that there is nothing left to run. Day-Lewis has described in interviews over the years his experience of the total immersion method of preparation he uses as both deeply absorbing and difficult to exit. The characters stay with him beyond the production period. They take time to leave. Plainview, given the depth and duration of the preparation and the extremity of the psychological territory the character occupies, would have required a significant period of reintegration after production ended. He did not make another film for 5 years after There Will Be Blood. His next role was in 9, a musical, released in 2009. After that came There Will Be Blood's mirror in certain ways, Lincoln in 2012. Another film about a driven and complex American man operating at the extreme end of his capacities in a specific historical moment. The distance between There Will Be Blood and those subsequent projects suggests something about what the Plainview preparation and production required, and what kind of recovery it necessitated. What Day-Lewis built in Daniel Plainview is the thing that makes the film's psychological analysis possible, in the way this essay has been conducting it. A character who is only words on a page can be analyzed as a construction, as a set of choices a writer made to produce certain effects. A character who has been inhabited by a performer, to the degree that Day-Lewis inhabited Plainview, becomes something closer to a real psychological case. The questions about what Plainview felt and why he made the choices he made, and what the long arc of his life's choices produced in him are, questions that the performance makes answerable in a way that pure script analysis could not. The sentimentality and love and loss that Day-Lewis found in those oil-field letters from 100 years ago are the substrate underneath everything the character does on screen. They are why the false Henry's betrayal produces grief rather than just anger. They are why the baptism scene breaks through into something real when Eli mentions the boy. They are why the reunion with H.W., after years apart, contains genuine warmth rather than just the performance of warmth. They are why, in the very last frame of the film, the man sitting on the floor of his bowling alley next to the body of his enemy looks less like a victor and more like someone who has been running for a very long time and has finally, in the worst possible way, been allowed to stop. The preparation made the performance. The performance made the psychology visible. And the psychology, once visible, reveals something about the character that goes beyond the film itself. Something about the specific kind of damage that a life built entirely around self-sufficiency produces. Damage that does not announce itself and does not look like damage from the outside and accumulates across decades until the man carrying it is sitting alone in the largest room he has ever owned with nothing left to want. That damage, and where it ultimately places Plainview in the larger conversation about what kinds of men this story in this era and this country produces, is the final question the film leaves open. And the answer to it is not simple, because the film was careful never to make it simple. And neither was the man who spent a year of his life making sure it would not be. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.